Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Steps You Can Take to Immediately Diversify Your Board and Major Donor Base. For those of you who are returning grants-based webinar participants, a warm welcome back. And to those of you who are here for the first time, I'm so glad that you're joining us today. I would also like to welcome the participants who are joining us for the community discussions taking place at our Funding Information Network partner locations throughout the state of California. My name is Elizabeth Cevada, and I'm a program associate here at Candid, based in New York City. And I'll be supporting today's webinar by managing polls, as well as collecting questions that you ask along the way and posing them during our Q&A. For those of you who are here for the first time, we want to share with you that on February 1st, we joined forces with GuideStar to become Candid. Together, we have over 88 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector, by the sector. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. With Candid, you can find funding with Foundation Directory online and search 140,000 funders and 12 million grants. And you can also increase your visibility with the funder community by creating or maintaining your GuideStar nonprofit profile. You can also continue to strengthen your nonprofit by participating in grants-based trainings to move your fundraising skills to the next level. To learn more about our capacity building training programs, you can visit grantsbase.org. We offer courses across the country at a location near you. I would now like to turn the controls over to our presenter, Armando Zumaya, so he can display his presentation. And as he takes the reins, I'd like to go ahead and introduce him a little bit. So Armando Zumaya has been fundraising for 32 years in a variety of roles that have given him a unique perspective on development offices, prospecting, and the role of prospect research and management. He is currently an active Chief Development Officer. Armando also speaks about the rise of Latino major giving in the US throughout his direct experience raising major gifts in the Latino community. He emphasizes the need for a new vision of Latino philanthropy throughout our nonprofit community. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Armando.
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth, for such a nice introduction. I hope everyone can hear me just fine. And I'm really excited to do this webinar for folks all over the country and beyond. It's a unique subject that has been talked about for a zillion years. For the last 20 years, there's been a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of people concerned about this issue in the nonprofit community. But there's not been a lot of action. There's not been a lot of change. The needle has, well, one can safely say the needle has not moved. And so this webinar is a very practical how-to approach to the issue. We're not going to talk so much. We will do an overview of the issue, but we're not going to talk as much about the issue. We're going to talk about how to fix it. So on the slide is my website. There's a lot more writing I have, a lot more other things I do, speaking and coaching you can take a look at. All right. So our learning objectives. All right, there we go. A couple of things we're going to be doing is we're going to have you, I call it looking in the mirror, make an assessment of your nonprofit, and basically stop and really ask yourselves the hard question, are we diverse? Do we look like our community? We're going to create a prospecting plan for potential donors and board members. We're also going to make sure that we know how to sell diversity, which unfortunately does need to be sold. To board and senior staff. And we're also going to talk about how to articulate your organization's value and how to really reach out to diverse communities for funding and support. Also, too, we're going to talk about a few actual real-time case studies. Now, when I talk about board members that are diverse, let me be very, very, very clear that this is a token-free zone. In every community in the United States, depending, where you are, of course, there are diverse people of influence, wealth, and success. Some places it's less. If you're in Vermont, for example, there's going to be less. Some places like Atlanta, there's a lot more, or LA, for example. And it's really a tremendous untapped potential. People all over the country are in extremely diverse communities with lots of diverse wealth, and you don't see that represented on boards, staff, or donor bases. We have to break the notion that a major donor is an older white man, okay? We just have to challenge that and look at that hard and go by the data and statistics and what prospect research tells us. Okay, so I'm going to talk more about all of these subjects going forward, but I will bore you very quickly with my background. I'm kind of a weirdo in the fact that I call myself a mutant, in that I cross the worlds of prospect research and fundraising. They're two different worlds, unfortunately, when they really are the same place. If you don't know what prospect research is, this is a good introduction for you. It's the power to know exactly the people you need to engage in your philanthropic work, in your nonprofit work. So prospect researchers are fundraisers. They are professional people who all they do is identify leads for you, leads for your organization. So I've been a CDO for a long time. I'm a vice president right now, and I've often focused a lot of my teaching around the country around major gifts prospecting. I teach cold calling, and I speak all over the darn place, which is a lot of fun, and I write too. So, all right, enough about me. Gosh, aren't I wonderful? So I think we're going to do a poll now, and turn that over. There it goes. So here's our poll. Did you want to talk about this, Elizabeth, or should I?
Sure. So we're going to do a couple of rapid fire polls here. So please, everyone who is online, just go ahead and give us a quick response. And for those of you who are hosting our community discussions, just a quick type into chat. Let me know what the majority of the room is saying. Are they saying yes or no to the response here? So does your board of directors match your community or alumni? I have about 50% of the room, and there's definitely an overwhelming answer here. So with 70% of the room now reporting, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. I'm going to move right on to the next one, which is, does your major donor look like your community or alumni? All right, and thank you to 60% of the room that has participated here in our second poll as well. So I'm going to go ahead and close this one, move on to our third one. I'll go ahead and launch this one. This one's a bit more nuanced here. Do you have an intentional effort to diversify your donors? Yes, we've implemented a new prospecting strategy, or perhaps you've created the strategy, but you haven't followed through. No, you haven't made the effort, and perhaps you haven't even discussed the makeup of your major donors. And if you're not sure, that's also perfectly fine. All right, and we have 75% of the room participating here in our third poll. So thank you. And we're moving right on to our final poll.
I can't wait to see the results.
All right, this is the final one. The answer options are very similar to the one previously, but this one's focusing on the board. So have you implemented a recruitment plan? Have you followed through with that recruitment plan? Have you made the effort? Have you discussed it? And again, perhaps you're not sure. All right, thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And Armando, I'm going to share these results both with you and our audience. And I'm looking forward to your comments here.
Sure.
So for our first poll, what does your board look like? Does it match the community? We have 75% of our participants sharing no. The responses were very similar in our in-person viewing parties.
Wow. Yeah, that's unfortunately, that's pretty normal. Usually, it's more of a disparity than even that. Usually the orange or red part is even smaller. Pretty stark right there. Okay.
So this is what our audience is experiencing and reporting for us. So this is definitely going to help set the stage for this conversation. When we look at our major donors, 79% of the room is sharing that their major donors do not look like their community or their alumni. And again, very similar responses with our in-person viewing parties.
Wow, geez. Yeah, this is pretty typical. You know, you're going to see some statistics that verify this in the presentation.
All right. Moving right along to the next one. Do you have an intentional effort to diversify your donors? There's a little bit more diversity here. We have a few more answer options. So working our way through them, it looks like the most popular responses here are no, we have not made the effort to diversify the board, or a split here with they've created the strategy, but they haven't followed through, as well as they've discussed it, or they haven't discussed the makeup of their major donors. Any thoughts on this one while I look for what our in-person party responded?
You know, it's interesting because the top one, and yes, we have, it almost mirrors some of the previous two slides, you know, in terms of people who actually do have diversity because they've actually done it. So those folks are probably on the line to see if they can fine tune their work, which is great. Maybe I can help them.
Yeah, and our folks in Santa Barbara are reporting that they have not discussed the makeup of their major donors is the most popular answer, as well as reporting that it has not been discussed in our other viewing parties as the most popular answer as well.
Now, I know Santa Barbara well. It has a huge diversity problem in its donor base and boards. You look at the museums there, it's pretty stark.
All right, so moving to our final results here. Again, a bit more spread out when it comes to the board. So it looks like, you know, there's a pretty even split amongst those first three options of, you know, actually implementing the strategy, having one but not following through, as well as having made the effort, or not having yet made the effort, but hopefully soon. And again, similar responses for our in-person viewing parties, with option 4 being the most popular.
Yeah, it's thank you so much for doing this, Elizabeth. I think there's a wide disparity in what's considered an effort to diversify. There's probably going to be some efforts where it's, you know, somebody verbalizes it and they think they're doing it. And there's some people with very definite plans and efforts and expense and time put into it, which is a whole different world. So, you know, that's really interesting. Thank you. This is going to inform some of the things we're going to talk about now. All right, let's transfer out of this. So I call this mirror time, and we have to have, to really build diversity. I had a board chair once who basically stood up in front of the board and said, you know what, we're all white people, and 34% of our community is Hispanic. Why don't we have any Hispanic board members? And it was very uncomfortable for everyone in the room. But it's courage. You need courage to address diversity. You need courage to really look in the mirror and talk about why hasn't your organization done this. And you know, we can take some questions. We can take some statements from people. If you want to read those, Elizabeth, or should we just move on? What do you think?
We have plenty of comments. I'm going to go ahead and share those during the Q&A to get that conversation started.
Okay, so we'll do that later on then. Wonderful. Like I said, courage is a crucial issue here. You know, let me share some insight, and this may sound egotistical, but I write articles all the time, and some of my articles are read by thousands of folks. The best article I ever wrote was about turnover in development officers, and that's been read almost 29,000 times. If I write an article that's about diversity, it gets read maybe 100 times. And also I can see, because of LinkedIn, the magic of LinkedIn, who's reading it. So there's this phenomena where if I write an article about diversity nonprofit fundraising, only people of color read it. overwhelmingly, not 100%, of course. But what does that tell you? It tells you that a bunch of well-meaning liberal white folks who care about this issue bypassed that article for some reason. Maybe they're burned out on it. Maybe they feel they don't know what to do about it. Maybe they feel they've heard the whole story. There are a lot of articles on this subject that talk about this issue but don't offer answers. Okay, so I think that's crucial, is to let's talk about how to work on this and fix this. So there's two big words on this page that if you're going to work on this, you have to ask yourself, how am I going to do these two words? Well, it's three words, really. Intentionality. So you've seen universities advance diversity in major giving. I'm also aware of a couple of big national environmental nonprofits that are building diversity in major giving. And they're doing this because they're doing it intentionally. So intentionality is what you want to tattoo on your arm if you want to be about getting diverse people of color to give you major gifts and to be on your board. We'll go into that in more detail. But if you spend money on a major gifts officer who only works on people of color in a certain area, guess what? You're going to, raise major donors of people of color. If you don't, you won't. We also tend to fundraise from those who we know in our circles. Most very well-intentioned white folks on boards or development staffs believe they know their community very well. They believe they're very well connected into their community. And none of us know everyone in the community. Maybe if we're the mayor or something, we know everybody, or we're the congressperson. So there's that issue, is we think we know our community when we often know a bit of it. Implicit bias here is the big issue that's unwritten. And so it's something, it's not really racism in most instances, it's the implicit bias. I raised $1 million gift from a Latino, a Chicano, a Mexican-American, whatever you want to call us, for an art museum, and he went to a major university. And that university, he told me, has never approached him for a gift or to be active or for anything. So I had a conversation, off the record conversation with some of the development leaders there and their prospect researchers. And there was basically, because of his Latino last name, and he was raised by migrant farm workers, some implicit bias there. And there was an assumption that he couldn't possibly be rich, even though I Googled the man and saw he sold his company back to Google, actually, for $450-something million. But there was some sort of assumption there that it was an implicit bias issue. So that's an example of why did they walk past this guy, even though you can see he has money? Or actually, they didn't bother to see that he had money. They just saw his last name and somebody's gears went off in their head and said, no, that's okay. So it's interesting. Victimization. So we're often seen as victims, especially Latinos. We're seen as recipients of aid. There's also a tremendous lack of knowledge about the changes in wealth in this country. People do not know that Latinos, African Americans, African American women, extremely entrepreneurial, extremely successful, especially at small private businesses. It's harder to track, and there's not a lot of sophistication in fundraising, excuse me for saying that, when it comes about prospect research. And finally, there's a lack of program involvement in the communities of color, especially around high net worth people of color. And finally, the other thing that's really important here, besides intentionality, is the word prospect, the term, not a word, Armando, prospect research. Prospect research, again, is the methodology. It's a staff position. It's a profession that will help you find people of color in your community who will give you a lot of money and join your board. It's that simple. It's, people say, do your research. I'm telling you, don't complain and tell me there's no African American people who care about your issue that could give you a major gift. Find them, okay? Find them. Go out there, pay for a prospect researcher, a freelancer, hire one, direct your people to find these people. I am. That's what I'm doing right now. So the country's changed, but nonprofit world has not. I've got Salsa and ketchup on here because since 1972, salsa has outsold ketchup in the United States of America. Okay, so the country's changing. Last year, Latino music outsold country music in the United States of America. So, you know, walls or no walls, this country is changed, and it will continue to change. Still, depending on what stat you go by, it's 80 to 90% of boards out there are white, 85% of staff, and 73% of donors. And like I said, the problem has been for many years that people talk about this as a problem, they wring their hands, they get upset, and nothing changes. Because in my mind, there's not a lot of sophistication around approaching this effort and doing the research and methodically, intentionally looking for this. Because there's not a lot of intentionality and good prospect research done in fundraising in the first place. 70% of nonprofits don't have a major gifts program. For example, 90% of nonprofits are under $5 million. So those two statistics tell you that most organizations don't have major giving, they don't have successful fundraising. And so when you don't have successful fundraising, very commonly you don't have good prospect research. You're not doing your research to find the right donors for you. And what you have is a perpetuation of an all-white nonprofit leadership. So here's the reality. The National Diversity Council does some good statistics here, but the buying power of Latinos is 1.7 trillion and growing massively. And here's another statistic that will, make you scratch your head a little bit, which is businesses. That $350 billion in business are started by Latinos. The Asian American and African American contributions are also massive in this country. People think of us as victims, but corporate America doesn't. Turn on a Honda commercial or a commercial for Coca-Cola. If you watch a TV commercial, look at the family in that commercial. And overwhelmingly, those families could be Latinos, okay? They have black hair and they look like Latinos, and that's because corporate America knows we spend a lot of money. And so people have to really stop and look at these statistics. Sure, do we have income issues? Absolutely. Is there poverty amongst our populations, Black and Hispanic especially, and some newer Asian Americans? Absolutely. And we have higher rates of poverty, higher rates of unemployment. Absolutely. There's tremendous injustice and work to be done there. What I'm saying is there's a lot more wealth and philanthropy than people know, because we haven't looked. As much as the Caucasian community, no, not yet. But we walk past wealthy African Americans and wealthy Latinos all the time. And certainly wealthy Asian Americans, we don't engage them for whatever reason. All right, let me click here. All right, so we're going to talk about the board of directors, because you can't change your institution unless the board's behind you. And let me be really clear, moral pressure and white guilt do not work. They haven't worked for 20 years. That's what the nonprofit world has tried, and it doesn't work. Tokenism is highly ineffective. Finding a person with a brown skin to sit on your board, who's your neighbor or your teacher or whatever, it's insulting and ineffectual to reach the community you need to reach. And it's super important that you get 100% board support, because if you don't, this effort will be eventually undermined in some shape or form. You need a realistic timeline, depending on the size of your institution. It could take anywhere from 9 months to years to really implement an effective diversity plan. And finally, think about your sales to your board being about revenue and building into new markets. A lot of people in the for-profit world understand expansion into new markets. It's something that they get. It's also about long-term sustainability. You know, if you're in Atlanta and you don't have African-American major donors in your donor base, you know, you better question your viability in the long term. So you better start, you know, changing with your community and changing with the wealth in your community, or you won't be there in 10 years because you won't be an effective fundraiser. So that's just hardcore money and revenue. And finally, if you're, you know, working on teenage pregnancy in California or Texas or Florida, and you don't have any Latinos involved as major donors or board members, and you're not reaching out into that community, are you really doing your job as an institution? So you have to have more effective community outreach when you have people of color who belong to that community leading your program efforts. So those are all ways to tell your board we need to diversify. It's not about guilt, it's about fundraising. So my argument is that 20 years of trying to guilt white leaders into diversifying their nonprofits doesn't work. However, fundraising hard financial realities does work. And, you know, corporate America certainly understood this. So we do have to say, I have a separate slide for this because we do have to say these things out loud in a board meeting. We do have to say there is racism, there is implicit bias, and there is sexism. It's extremely common for a couple to be looked at, and we look at the guy first, always. When again, wealth and women, wealth and race have changed dramatically in this country. And so we need to look at those hidden barriers and ask our board members and ask our leadership to think about this in themselves and ask themselves, have I looked at somebody, seen their last name, seen their face, and made a personal assumption that, oh, it couldn't be, you know, a major donor. We say that to ourselves. And so when people see me or they see somebody who's Asian, do they make an assumption? And so having that hard discussion, that look in the mirror with your board is a hard discussion, but we've got to use these three words, guys. And finally, with this is an intentionality to address these issues, to intentionally look internally, and then intentionally do our prospect research and look externally for new board candidates and new major donors of color. Okay, so now let's talk about board recruitment. It is definitely the hardest part because let's be very frank, as development officers, we're in a delicate position sometimes to tell our board what to do. We can push them, but we also like our jobs. Okay, so there is a cone of silence for development officers. We are cautious about, you know, looking too pushy, looking too militant, looking, you know, what's this guy doing on diversity? Shouldn't he be raising us money? We are nervous about looking like, you know, we're nervous about our interactions with our board. So it puts us at a disadvantage. So right now, how do you recruit on your board? Is it where, you know, the board goes to the same group of people they know and do that intentionally and internally? And so you're going to get a board that looks like your current board. Is your CEO or ED involved? Probably. But if your ED and CEO is a white person, do they know diverse people of influence, of, you know, of importance and usefulness for your board of wealth? Maybe they do. Sometimes they do. Maybe sometimes they don't. So I want to make a pitch for development here. So development is very crucial to take a leadership position in assessing candidates. You can create a simple way to judge candidates and give a matrix or ask your board if you can do an assessment of board candidates. You can also do your research and bring forward candidates. Okay, so that's really crucial. In my job, I ask my prospect researcher to identify diverse, wealthy candidates who care about our issues we work on. And we have a whole slate of them we're working on right now. And there's no tokens there. They're all people who give to our cause, who are wealthy, who are multicolored and diverse. Multicolor is a funny way to put it. But that's completely feasible. And we also assess candidates. So if a board member brings forward a candidate, we make an assessment based on development. Are they good fundraisers? Have they been on major gifts committee? Do they make gifts themselves? Are they philanthropic? And so this is a way for development to start to influence your board and make it more diverse and more development friendly and better fundraisers. All right. So let's talk about your general donor base. Stop and ask yourselves, do you have the statistics of what your community actually looks like? And so for some of you, if you're going to be in Pittsburgh, your community is Pittsburgh. But if you're a national organization, you're going to be national. So do think about that. And also, who cares about your cause? Maybe broader geographically than you think, especially if it's a unique cause. It's something, just because you're based in a town doesn't mean all your donors are in that town. And so do take a look at your internal assumptions about a population. So I worked in the Bay Area around a Latino art institution. And people told me, well, one, there's not a lot of Latinos up here in Northern California, and two, they're not very wealthy. So both of those turned to be pretty false. Are there much less Latinos than Los Angeles? Absolutely. And in Southern California? Absolutely. But there was still veins of wealth I found in the tech industry, in construction, in restaurants, in food. And so I did find it's like tapping a vein of gold in a mine. You find it. And there's other people who've also law too. So wherever there's a meritocracy, often you'll see people of color rising up and making a lot of money. And law and sometimes investment are one of those places. It's harder with investment, especially when you talk about venture capitalists, excuse me. But so what's important right now is for you to look at your community, see what the percentages are demographically, but also look for the wealth in each demographic. There may be less, than we'd like, but there will be wealth. And the classic thing with some communities is to find the people who've made it, the people who've been there a long time. I was in, I believe it's Oklahoma City, last year, giving a speech, giving a seminar, and there was a significant group of Latino old wealthy money there who were oil workers and who had started oil engineering businesses and oil equipment businesses back in the 50s and were still there and still Spanish speaking. So it was really interesting. I was in Arizona last week, and there was a group of people who were telling me about the expat community from Mexicans who had moved to become American citizens and moved to Arizona. So that was really interesting. So know your whole community. And finally, know prospect research. Know the power of prospect research. I put down the professional organization is APRA for prospect research, just like you would think of AFP for fundraisers. So if you go to APRA Home, you'll see all of the world of prospect research. All right. So think about how you look externally to other communities. Is your website multilingual? Do you have people who could answer a question in Mandarin? Do you work on issues in that community? Are you out there in that community? Is there a festival and you have a table that's multilingual in that community or not? Do you work on issues that matter to these people? For years, I've had a big issue with the diabetes nonprofits. The #1 killer of Mexicans, like me, and they have no money and no board representation from Latinos. Amazing, It's like can you imagine, a disease that affects disproportionately the white community where there was no white people involved in it? That wouldn't happen. And so you have to ask yourself also that your board and staff, do they represent the community? And you have to, start to mirror that. And so you want to go to events, you want to go to convenings, you want to be part of that community in whatever way is relevant for your program, and start to show your flag, as they say, and be part of that. Okay, so let's talk about recruiting staff. I've done this in my past in consulting. So again, you have to make a long-term plan to recruit staff, especially senior leadership, because there's a lot of, I can speak more for the Latino community. I just started by the way, if you're a Latino and you're in fundraising, I just started a new LinkedIn group, Latino Fundraisers and Development Officers. Please join, TV commercial over. So do check that out. But you can use executive search. You can use LinkedIn. Ask your executive search for a propensity of diverse candidates, for example. You can do in-house HR recruitment. You can literally ask your HR people to specifically research and find candidates of color because you want diversity that represents your community in the area and go after them specifically. And there are people of color affinity groups in the nonprofit world and outside of the nonprofit world. There are, young professional organizations for African American women that you can see people who are accomplished, who have good college degrees, who might go into development, who might go into nonprofits, and that you could recruit. So it's a colder recruitment than most, but you can do that too. You can also find development officers inside those groups, or junior development officers who would take a development officer position. What I do too is I recruit and train beginner staff, and with the idea of retaining them long term. But what I do is I recruit and train those staff and raise them from inside the ranks. And finally, there's Hispanic serving institutions and historically Black universities across the country where you can recruit directly, especially if you're a larger institution, you can do this, but do know about those. So when it comes to recruiting and retaining diverse staff, make sure you have your HR packages together and intentionally go after those individuals with the intention of balancing your staff and put some effort into that. That's literally all it's about. It's about putting the focus on it. So creating a donor diversity plan is really interesting because, like I said earlier, you want to understand your demographics. You can do surveys too. Survey monkeys are helpful. A survey monkey is helpful. Paper surveys still work sometimes. And so you want to understand your community and ask them what they care about inside the work that you do. So I saw a major environmental national nonprofit do this. They sent out a massive electronic survey to diverse communities. They asked diverse community organizations, churches, professional organizations, Chamber of Commerce's, if they could ask them, okay, inside the environment, which are your prime issues you care about? And they were shocked to learn that, for example, in this case, Latinos, the #1 issue for them was climate change. They understood it, they were on it. And a lot of people would say, well, isn't immigration like your #1 issue? When in reality, the environment for a lot of Latinos is the prime issue. The second one was water quality, which is also super interesting. So doing surveys like that can be really helpful to guide your messaging and focus, especially when you're out there in the community talking about what you do. You can also look into the communities and recruit spokespeople, recruit people who can help you introduce you and guide you. I've done this before in the Asian community in San Francisco, and go out there and, say you're a foreigner in your own land and you want to meet new people and create true diversity. People appreciate when you reach out. And there's standing institutions. There's a Black or an African American Chamber of Commerce in the tiniest towns on earth today. You'll find Latino business organizations all over the country. So find them. Often you'll see wealth right there, right in front of your face because of the titles and the businesses you're dealing with. And so those are great ways to start to build understanding of the donors you want to reach and how to reach them. I saw a small community in Louisiana where the board literally had this come to Jesus meeting, to be honest, about their whiteness. And they started to send board members out to talk to African-American organizations, churches, and they literally, through that process, identified ideal board members and donors, and now they're much more diverse, for example. And this is real shoe leather kind of work. This is not sophisticated, but it worked, and people appreciated them coming out. So another thing is a sub-campaign. So let's click to the next slide. A sub-campaign is a way for you to use fundraising to get more people of color involved. So, for example, when I worked for a cancer organization, we were looking at doing research into cancer proclivity in a certain subgroup of an Asian community. And so that was something that would be very relevant to Asian donors of this subgroup. And what we did was we identified key leaders in that community who we could go to. So identified through prospect research, let's be specific, who would work on that with us in that community. And so that was part of sort of the groundwork. We created it's super important you understand that this has to be a very feasible short-term campaign, almost ridiculously feasible. And so the term I use is slam dunk, because you want to have success in fundraising in that community, and you want people to know that you did that. So it has to be something highly tangible and highly measurable. So in this instance, we were trying to assess the cancer rates in an Asian sub-community, and we needed people to support that and how to treat them and how to support them. So people who were major wealthy people who we'd never reached out to, we went to, who were Asian folks, we went and approached them and said, we want to do this in your community. Will you give money to help us do this? And here's the exact results we'll get. It'll inform our efforts to help us reach out to your community more effectively. And people gave money for it because they saw direct benefit into their community. Also, too, a little bit in the PR department, too, they saw that it would make them look like $1 million because they're literally fighting cancer in their own community. So, like I said, this is a slam dunk. And at the end, you can model donors. So if you have a little sub-campaign into a community with something that's extremely tangible, extremely relevant, at the end, you model those donors back to that community. And so people who haven't given or haven't been involved will see how you treat your donors, and they'll see that they can give to you, and maybe you've made one of these people a board member, so they're treated with respect, and it changes your dynamic with that community. So I hope that makes sense. And finally, like I said, it builds trust. You're known by that community, you're known as caring, and putting your money down and your effort and your staff time into that community's well-being. Okay, so let's talk about major giving a little bit. So you want to look for affinity circles like you do in all major giving, but the affinity circles are a little different when it comes to people of color. They're a little different because you have to, so with Caucasian or white folks, there's wealth in almost every industry. With people of color, you want to find affinity circles that are social and industry-based. So there's an organization in the African-American community called the Links. The Links are a great institution. They're African-American women of prominence and success, and they're all over the darn country. And that's one where I've often found philanthropic women looking to step up. There's also Latina giving circles all over the Southwest and in New York now. Those are affinity circles you could find. And also, it's different with major giving in the fact that nobody asks us. So the guy I told you that gave me $1 million for the art institution, nobody had ever asked him for money, even though you could see online the guy was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's a little different with some Latinos and some Asian folks. I know the African American folks I've worked with to raise large gifts from have already been very philanthropic in the past. So it's different. But with new, you'll find more new philanthropy. So that means with that fellow, I had to walk him through, okay, here's how you make a gift. Here's your ways to make a gift. Here's what you get for making a gift. It was like philanthropy 1A. So that does happen more often, not always, but more often with people of color who've not been asked before. Doesn't mean they don't want to be asked. It means they just haven't. Also, too, with African Americans and Latinos, there's more privately held wealth, especially in real estate, especially in private businesses, for whatever reason. I don't know about Asian American community. I don't have the stats on that. I haven't been able to find them, to be honest. But I know that about us. So the need for prospect research is even more important here. So you also can find a ready source of people in business associations and chambers of commerce that are out there all the darn time. And finally, you can look for the dominant industries. So if you're looking for Latino money in Los Angeles, you can look at a couple of places. For example, this is just an example. I know you don't live in LA, maybe you do. But construction, law, music, entertainment law, parking lots, landscaping, or just restaurants are some of the places where Latinos are making, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And this is just through good research and looking at, business chamber of commerce lists, looking at people who are successful business people, and finding the dominant industries for your ethnic groups in your neighborhoods, in your communities. So specifically about identification techniques, if you don't have a prospect researcher, you need to hire a freelance prospect researcher. So where do you find those? You can find them online. On my website, there is a free list of prospect researchers. So you can look it up there. Or also, you can find them through LinkedIn. There's a LinkedIn prospect research group. And you can find them through APRA sometimes too, the organization I mentioned earlier. So literally, you can go to a prospect researcher or freelancer, let's say you're in Chicago, and say, well, I want to find Latinos who give over $5,000 to children's health issues who live in the greater Chicago area. And I need their phone numbers and emails and backgrounds on them. And you'll get that. So this is the #1 tool for diversity people aren't using, is show me a list of wealthy African-American folks in New Orleans who've given to the environmental issues nationally over $1,000, over $10,000, whatever. It depends on your community, depends on the wealth. You're going to find people, maybe not as much as we'd like, but you're going to find people. And then you can network that list inside your board, inside your donors, or you can just cold approach some people. So that's, key is to get good identification. LinkedIn is a great source of that. I've done that many times. There are lots of racially, ethnically identified organizations on LinkedIn that you could sort by your community, by geography, and sometimes you can even sort by causes on LinkedIn. So that's another way. You can ask a prospect researcher to identify key industry and key industry leaders in your community, and then sort them by people of color. And finally, you can find associations of all kinds online. I found the big one for me in the Bay Area was the tech industry, was surprisingly finding tons of Latinos rising in the tech industry, not as much as white people, and still a minority, but more than I expected, much more than I expected. So that's kind of the bottom line is, yes, there's not as much money as white people yet, but we're rising and there's more than you think. So you can also test a campaign. And this is going to be in major donors and also in mailings, email campaigns. Be careful about the faces you show to your audience. You can do test, message campaigns. For example, when I was with a big health organization, we did a mailing about breast cancer. Before I got there, the mailing had the picture of the leader of their organization, who was a guy, and it was in Spanish talking about breast cancer. So because of the conservative nature about, messaging and different racial attitudes, this mailing was not only a failure, but there was a lot of angry phone calls from women and men, husbands and boyfriends, about this guy writing a letter to their wives, girlfriends, and daughters about their breasts. So it was a unique mistake. Also, the Spanish that was used, which was mostly to Mexican and Salvadoran women, was written by an Argentine woman. And so her Spanish was very different. It was kind of the brunt of jokes. So we tested again a different campaign, which was Latinas directly talking to Latinas. So we had about 5 different women, and especially Mexicans are very proud of where they come from in Mexico. So we had a picture of Irma. We would have Irma, and it would say San Diego, and below it, it would say Chiapas, because that's the state she's from. And then the next picture would be Gloria, and it would say Guadalajara. It would say Los Angeles and Guadalajara. And so the women seeing this mailing identified with these women. Those were their neighbors, their sisters, their co-workers. And that campaign raised a huge amount of money, had the highest open rate of any mailing we'd ever done. And it raised more money per capita than a similar mailing to white women, to give you an idea. So do test your mailings, do test different messaging, try to be very culturally relevant, language relevant, and don't assume, especially with Latinos, I think this is the case with Asian folks too, that we're all the same, that there's one grouping of us. We come in many shapes and forms, but we do have some cultural similarities. So do test the campaigns, try, just like you would with a normal campaign, but when you're mailing to a subgroup, do try that. So here's some really good case studies that really challenge a lot of conceptions about people out there. There was a whole hue and cry about the African American History Museum, the Smithsonian on the Mall, because people said, well, who's going to raise money for it? And the African American community just stepped up and said, watch. And so people who think African American folks aren't philanthropic, they don't have money, the National Museum on the Mall kind of shut everybody up. I think it's beautiful. I mean, the statistics you see here are factual, and it's a huge, huge victory in diverse fundraising. The Perez Museum in Miami, another one. George Perez, Jorge, gave a $30 million nucleus fund, and they raised $220 million in addition for that. So that's crazy. That's in Florida. The Latino Community Foundation, for example, a great organization here in San Francisco. They're doing the $1,000 giving circles. So this takes advantage of that mid-range wealth, especially amongst Latinas, to pledge $1,000 over a year, and they give their money and then direct the money towards Latina and Latino organizations. So that's another great example of really effective fundraising. And then there's the Apollo Theater, $20 million, very fast campaign. I know a lot of the donors on that campaign, really effective methods they've used. Old school, almost university fundraising, but that's another example of African-American fundraising. And then there's St. Jude and Univision. So there was a unique partnership, here we go, with St. Jude. So if you go to a Mexican market here in Northern California, you'll be looking for, I'll be looking for some achiote spice, and you'll hear over the intercom, este es el día para St. Jude. This is the day to give to St. Jude. I mean, literally, you're being marketed. And then when you check out, the woman at the counters begin to ask you in Spanish, are you going to give to St. Jude? And it's on the little checkout, keypad. And so I asked the head of these markets at one point, how much money have you raised in a month for St. Jude? And this is just in Northern California. This is just 14 stores. And the guy said $800,000. So St. Jude's very quiet about how much money they raise from Latinos, but the number I've seen is $110 million over the last few years. And this is all Spanish-speaking only people. They have a great partnership with radio stations because they know Latinos use a lot of radio, and Univision with like hunky DJs like this guy here in the picture. So they are very smart. If you want to see somebody raise a lot of money from Latinos, look at St. Jude and how effective they are nationally at raising money. They're a model. And there's lots of other organizations that have figured this out and are getting on the bandwagon, especially national organizations. So I think I'm almost to the end of my presentation. And here's a few examples of major donors. This is some of the, their wealth and things they're giving to in the country. It's very diverse. And a couple of these folks I know, nice people. And that's the bulk of the presentation. I do have a website, and I do speak around the country. I also have small contracts for 2 hours a month for coaching. I coach people around the country, and those are very feasible. Those are also on my website, and I'd love to talk to you and help you in the future. So Elizabeth, do we want to take questions now?
We do want to take questions now, and there have been lots and lots of folks asking about many of the resources that you mentioned throughout the presentation. So everyone will be getting a recording of this webinar to reference anything that Armando mentioned. Lots of those resources are on his website as well, and I'm sure he wouldn't mind that email for the clarification. But to get us started on the Q&A, I wanted to start with a question that came in from Jennifer, and I'll give you a moment to consider your response in case there is any nuance that we need to build in here. But Jennifer was interested in how what we just discussed and went through, talking about people of color and POC, can be applied to folks that perhaps are of a different sexual orientation than the organization, different gender, different ability, or perhaps just diversity in regards to financial diversity for both the board, specifically for here. I'll give you a second to consider your.
Oh, no, I don't need a second.
Go for it then. Let's jump in.
Yeah, no, LGBT folks are often overlooked because there's, if you have a board that does not have any LGBT folks on it, they often don't know that community. I work for a major arts institution in San Francisco, and we had no LGBT major donors, no LGBT, at least people who were out, board members. And so I broke that up because I really saw that there was tremendous wealth in the San Francisco LGBT community. And no, it applies. So when I mean diversity in all shapes and forms, all of its beautiful colors, one might say.
So would we still be applying the same strategies to create that diversity on the board?
So it's true, absolutely. The difference with prospect research and gay folks is that unless they're part and openly identify, because you can find LGBT lawyers on LinkedIn, you can find people who belong to prominent lesbian organizations, so you can identify them that way. Sometimes it's harder because they're not part of those institutions. It's not, there's not an automatic rainbow flag on their icons or anything. Mm-hmm. So it's not that they're, hiding or anything, but it's just not publicly, it's harder to see.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Once you break into that community, you can find a lot of wealth there.
Yeah, and I would say the same would go for ability. Folks aren't necessarily, announcing that perhaps they are dyslexic, but, that would perhaps be something, a valuable perspective to have as a board member. So it might just require being a bit more creative when providing that diversity onto the board.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you for fielding that, Armando. Our next question that we have here comes from, we have so many to choose from, but let's go ahead and actually jump over to Gene. He's actually turning this a little bit on its head. So he's wondering if you could provide some guidelines and tips on how to engage white people to actually join his non-diverse board of Black people.
Well, it would probably be the same thing, wouldn't it now? Mm-hmm. You want to reach out to those communities. When I told you about that small organization in Louisiana, it was literally, they had the famous conversation. I forget what they had a funny name for it, but it was basically where they said, "What, you know what? We're in Louisiana. We're all white. This is nonsense. You know, we work on issues that affect the whole community, not just white people. Or the disease we're working on doesn't just kill white people; it kills everybody." So they had to literally put, you know, their hat in their hand and go to the churches, go to the community organizations, and say, we're working to really reach out to you guys. And we, you know, we haven't before. It's kind of a mea culpa. There's a little bit of humility involved, but people appreciate that, you know, that the outreach. There's not a lot of, people get nervous and afraid of doing that when you shouldn't. So I would absolutely, you know, do your research and identify white people in your community who care about whatever you're working on. And, you know, there's lots of allies, you know, there's too many Latino organizations too. I don't know about African-American organizations that do exclude allies who are white. And so don't do that.
I think that's a really great point that you just stressed there. I want to also share some upcoming opportunities for folks to continue learning with us. So what we have coming up is on October 16th, we'll be hosting a panel of Indigenous philanthropic leaders from the Southwest and across the globe. And during this webinar, we'll be discussing how Indigenous and Native leaders are embracing traditional giving practice and introducing Indigenous-led grant making in their community. And then in November, we'll continue this series here where you will be able to learn how funders from across the U.S. are supporting and incentivizing nonprofits to come together through formal strategic alliances in order to improve their services and sustainability. And I'll be sharing the links to both of those trainings in the chat in just a moment. But Audrey has a really great clarifying question here, and I think it's definitely worth kind of digging into the nuances of who should be on your board. So her question is, are only the wealthy welcome on a diverse board? And I think this might speak to a couple other questions that we've gotten in where the wealth in the community that is served is not where the wealth resides.
So I am a fundraiser. I admit that publicly. And I do focus on building the boards that aren't tokens, that are, you can have a person who is specifically not wealthy, but who can make a decent philanthropic gift, or who's highly connected, highly powerful in that community. But I just don't want us to have tokens and to be looked at as victims. But yeah, the biggest problem with nonprofits for me in the country the biggest problem is the fact that we don't fundraise successfully. And what I'm saying is diversity is a mirror of that. So that's what I'm talking about, is we need to really, you know, build more of a diversity in terms of fundraising and more strength in fundraising. And that'll directly help us as nonprofits implement community programs and whatever our mission is. But yeah, I want to see many more nonprofits with effective, powerful, wealthy people of color, because there's so many tokens out there right now. It's nonsense.
And I think that kind of speaks to Ben's question that came in. He wants to know, how does a nonprofit catering to the general population compete for diverse board members when those candidates are in demand for other boards that relate more closely to their minority demographic?
Well, again, this is do your research. I worked someplace where one of the board members, African-American woman, told me, hey, you know, listen, we have, I know all of the African-American people in town of wealth, and they're asked by everybody and their brother, so it's really kind of a waste of time. So what I did was I did my research, and I found 48 more African-American people who were multimillionaires in that town who gave to causes very similar to what we were working on. And that was my answer, is find the people. And, you know, depending on where you are, there's no automatic diverse group of people you find, but you're going to find more, and you're going to find people that will surprise you that you don't know are there. But it's all about, like I said, getting the information, doing your research. If this was a business and these people were customers, you would absolutely do your research because you want every dollar brought in the door. In the nonprofit world and fundraising, we don't do our research.
The next question that I have here comes in from Jessica, and she's providing a scenario for us. So we've hired a prospect researcher. They were able to provide leads, and now we actually want to contact those leads. How would you actually pick up the phone and call them? She's imagining cold calling someone to introduce herself, to see if they want to get coffee and learn about her cause and see if they would be interested in donating. But how would you actually field the question of how, Jessica got their name and phone number?
Well, I would be very frank with them. So I would tell them, I do my research, and you're a leader in the community. And we researched you online, and you seem to be, this may be an issue you'd want to learn about. And you're right, a very soft approach is appropriate here. Unfortunately, I'm the only guy in the country that teaches cold calling for development officers. If, on my website, there is a webinar you can buy, a recording of it. But that aside, it is pretty, it's, a lot of development officers do this already with prospects. It's the same thing with board recruitment or a diverse prospect, is you want to give them the opportunity to learn about your institution. They don't have to take it. It's very easy to get out of. You're not an arm-twisting salesperson, but you say, this is what we're working on. Do you want to learn more? And then have a good conversation with them and orient them, and hopefully sell them and get them enthused about what you're doing.
Thank you, Armando. So Michael has a clarifying question. He wants to know if his board diversity ratio should reflect those who care about his cause in the area, or should the ratio of diversity in the area be what's leading it, regardless of how much someone might care about their cause.
I'm not sure I understand that question completely.
Let me clarify. Should the ratio of diversity be made up of those who really care about the cause, or should the diversity on the board be reflective of what their community looks like, regardless of how much the community cares about the cause?
So, it depends. If you're saying that a community doesn't care about your cause, how do you know that? How do you know? So this is a classic issue of, there's been a lot of racism toward Latinos, because the people will say, well, they're not really givers, they're not philanthropic. Or the African American community, they're not really, this isn't their issue. How do we know that? Don't make that assumption till you have hard data that shows you that's not the case. So we don't know if a certain population cares about something or not. They may not, but often we make the assumption that they're not philanthropic and they don't care about this issue. The eye-opener for me was some of the data I saw around the environment, where Latinos, that's a top issue for them. It's more important than lots of other issues. Who would have thought that? A lot of environmental organizations say, oh, Latinos don't care about the environment. Yes, we do. All right.
Thank you, Armando. Our next question is coming in from Krista. Her current scenario is that 50% of her board is made up of POC through a very intentional effort. However, they do struggle to find individuals who can represent and speak for their clientele, and also actually have the time to take part on the board. So is there any suggestions that you have on overcoming this hurdle of time when it comes to diversity?
I'm trying to get a handle on this question. Is it because, why is time and diversity an issue, or is it remote, or yeah, it's hard to tell a good answer. I mean, there's all kinds of good board practices out there for improving participation that go for anybody, regardless of color, or job, or geography. But it's hard to really give a good answer unless I knew more particulars.
Mm-hmm. And Krista, if you're on the line, feel free to provide any clarifying details for that. We'll swing back to it if Krista responds.
Email me, Krista, for God's sakes.
All right, so our next question here is coming in from Carson, and he says that he reached out about 2 years ago to a number of potential diverse board members who he knew were interested in his NGO's work. We're looking at about 7 to 8 folks here. One of them joined a committee, but none of them actually joined the board. So even though the whole board is committed to adding people of color, they haven't gotten much traction. Any folks on how to continue?
Yeah, it's unfortunately there's a high attrition rate when you do any type of board recruitment. So if I'm going to approach 50 people to get 2 or 3. So it is hard work. It's not easy. It is something. It depends on how glamorous and well known and well thought of your institution is. If your institution is an opera, a famous educational institution, it becomes a lot easier. If you're less well known or you have a colored reputation, or mixed reputation, I should say in this context, then it's harder, a lot harder. I've always recruited for smaller organizations and struggled with that, but I do get there because I have quantity of candidates. So it is, it depends. When I worked for very glamorous, prestigious institutions, recruiting people of color was easy. I mean, it was literally 6 months, 9 months to get, a handful of new diverse board members on board. When I've done it with lesser known institutions, institutions that are not well understood, it's a lot harder. So, and you need many more candidates. That's perseverance is the answer here.
Thank you. And Krista was able to provide some clarification. So what she's saying is those who best represent the community that she serves are low income and frequently have jobs that are inflexible and don't have much free time to actually attend board meetings during common meeting hours. But they definitely do want that representation on their board. So recommendations on how to overcome that hurdle.
Yeah, then you're going to have weekend board meetings or electronic board meetings. Or less frequent board meetings, but yeah, that's more of a board management and less of a diversity issue as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you, Armando. And thank you to everyone who is continuing to ask their questions. There's definitely plenty here to dive into. So the next one that we're going to go ahead and approach actually comes in from Amy. And she said her board is made up of 75% very upper class white females, and that her agency is worried about letting these wealthy individuals go because they are donors. However, none of them are invested in her agency and rarely make appearances at board meetings. So her agency has hit a brick wall. How does she help her agency move away from this fear of letting the wealth go and allowing more folks to actually get their hands dirty?
Replace it with, depends where you live, replace it with diverse wealth. Find Black women, Latinas, and Asian women who can give as much or close to as much money as those white women who aren't involved. And if those white women aren't involved and are coming to board meetings, are they giving? If they're not giving, then you're not losing anything. But if they are giving, you can have both. Doesn't mean you have to kick them all to the curb, but it means that you can bring in and slowly diversify and bring in more, diverse wealth. That's all there is to it. And identify those folks and approach them.
Do you have any suggestions on how perhaps Amy might be able to have that conversation with her leadership or with the board?
Oof, that is challenging because it requires that mirror time situation, where you have to use statistics and hard numbers to prove your point here. If these women are actually giving, then you can still say we need more diverse giving. If they're not giving and it's more of a society board, if that's what I call them, you see a lot of them in the arts institutions and sometimes in children's hospitals, where it's more like I want to be seen. It's not about really giving, or giving a fraction of what you actually could. And actually do to other institutions, then yeah, I would say, listen, we've got 6 board women who don't give or give very little, and we need to, change that. You can also create giving board job descriptions that have giving minimum give-gets that will change the dynamic in terms of giving. I did this at an art institution where I created a new board job description that was passed, and it forced a lot of dead wood off the board. A lot of people who didn't want to give, didn't want to come to board meetings, didn't want to go to artistic presentations, they just wanted their name on the board, dropped off because they didn't want to make a minimum gift. And it was a small minimum gift. They didn't want to come to board meetings. They just wanted their name on the letterhead and put it on their LinkedIn, and it helps them get clients, and they can say they're on the board. But if you want to clear those people off, create like a 30 pound. In the Army, they have a backpack that's 30 pounds, and you have to march with it. So you create a march that's rigorous where people got to keep up, or if they're not into it, they'll leave.
Thank you, Armando. So we have a really interesting question here from Lynn, who wants to know if you have any advice on the initial outreach or first-time contact to someone, to a POC who they wish they would like to have the opportunity to meet and try to engage.
And you mean in terms of actually reaching them?
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course you want to network and see if there's anybody you know, board members, former board members, current donors who know them, who can give you a warm introduction. That's always preferred. So do your research, have a researcher look at that person and see if there's anybody that you know LinkedIn helps there, RelSci helps there, that's another software. But if you need to cold call that person, cold call them. Just pick up the phone. There are, like I said, I teach this, there are techniques that improve your chances. But be honest about why you're approaching them, be open and transparent. I often say I put my dunce cap on. It sounds really funny to say, but I'm just very innocent, and I say, yeah, I'm calling you, I researched you, here's what my institution's working on. I'd like to sit down with you for a half hour and tell you what we're doing. Maybe you'll care about it, you'll be thrilled, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll say, no, that's okay. I'm not there to ask you for money, I'm not there to twist your arm. But please, give me a half hour so I can explain to you what we're doing. It may be important to you, may not. But you can't make a decision until you know. And that's a very common approach I use. It's very open, very honest, and people appreciate it. And by and large, if I get somebody on the phone, it's about a 90% chance I'll get an appointment with them.
Absolutely. Paige brings a really good point. Her organization is nonpartisan, but oftentimes inclusion and diversity can be seen as a partisan or liberal issue. So what are your recommendations in actually having a conversation about diversity that shows that someone's organizational intentions are beyond partisan or not partisan at all?
Wow, I'd have to know more about that institution, but diversity isn't a partisan issue. If somebody thinks that, that's unfortunate, because there's political institutions in this country that literally are excluding people from voting because of the color of their skin and their income, or their income. So diversity is power. I don't care what party you belong to, but if you're only want one color of people, you're going to be in trouble either way. This country's too diverse for that. So if she's pushing up against people who say, oh, that's a liberal issue, then, I don't know what to say about that, literally.
So we have a couple folks on the line who actually work with children or students or minors in general as the community that they serve. So when we think about the major donors or potential board members, obviously the children can't serve on the board. So how do we kind of identify how to diversify the board that represents that community?
Well, I mean, do they have parents, grandparents? Of course, you can't have an 8-year-old on the board. That'd be pretty damn cute, but no, identify the folks who care about children in that community.
And there have been a number of questions that have come in as well as how to actually find a prospect researcher. I know you mentioned that there is a LinkedIn group for prospect researchers, but when someone's actually thinking of bringing someone on, what would perhaps be the time and cost associated with that, as well as how would you actually find and identify a prospect researcher?
Yeah, damn good question. So unfortunately, the only list of freelance prospect researchers is on my website in the country, which is telling. I mean, and my website's like, it's handmade. I made it. It's not fancy. But that's a free list. I don't get any money from putting those folks there. They don't, pay me anything. You don't have to pay anything to access it. Just take a look at it. It's under lists. LinkedIn has FRPA, the Freelance Prospect Research Association. APRA also has something called Prospect L, which is a prospect researcher listserv, and that's 4,900 prospect researchers around the country talking to each other. You can approach your local APRA chapter. If you look at APRA online, aprahome.org, you can look at their local chapter, and there'll be prospect researchers there as a professional organization. And you can ask people about freelancing there. But my list is the only one where there's probably about 20, 30 of them listed around the country. I recruit them all the time and have them put their names and information on the list. But that's one way you can do it. Often, if you're in a big town, there's a university, they're going to have prospect researchers. And you can approach them and say, "Do any of you guys want to freelance? We need some help." And people will pick you up on it. So that's a couple of strategies.
Thank you. And again, the question of cost for a freelancer, when people are kind of coming around their budgets, what's a good ballpark for this?
So it depends. So a freelancer for a month can be anywhere from like $1,400 a month to $3,000 on up a month, depending on how much you have them do and how many hours they put in. Those are just general ballpark numbers. And so I often really ask people to think about not so much the cost, but the ROI for this. Because if you find one good donor from a prospect research list, and you will, it'll more than pay for itself. And so I've literally instructed and helped consult with clients who have found, have had a list of 60 major gifts prospects brought forward. They paid the researcher, $3,900 to get it done. And they found their first donor for $100,000, literally in the first few phone calls. And so it's a great investment, no matter what you do, knowing who's rich and who cares about your cause, no matter how long it takes for you to engage them, that's a good investment.
Thank you, Armando. And of course, funders also do care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we recently updated our GuideStar demographic section. So go ahead and show your funders that you care about this too. You can add your demographic info into your nonprofit profile on GuideStar by visiting guidestar.org/update. This is very, very new. We launched it last month, so definitely let us know what you think about this new section that we do have for your profile. The next question that I wanted to approach here comes from Kaylee, and she knows that it can take a very long time to actually get a new board member on your board. It can take a very long time. So she would love to hear your thoughts on how to avoid having the first diverse board member feel like a token in a room that is predominantly older white people.
Yeah, that is the freshman class, as I call them. It's a tough situation. And what I've done before is, as a development officer, I've tried to brief my board to treat that individual just like anybody else, and to not, reference their color or their LGBTness or anything, because that's when people get awkward, when you think that because she's a black woman, she speaks for all black people, No, she doesn't. She's just coming with a diverse view that's different. But don't put them in a situation where their differences are treated as something where people treat them with kid gloves and negative. but treat them just like every other board member. Give them responsibilities, hold them accountable. That's all anybody who's, comes from another community wants is a fair shot and to be treated just the same as everybody else. But you do have to prepare your board for that and talk to them about that in public and try to just be very open about that. Now, there are diversity consultants around inclusion that are useful with that. So you can also look at hiring somebody to talk to you about inclusion too.
And we also have a really great question that came in from Nancy. She is with a faith-based organization, and there's just little diversity within the faith. So how would you recommend bringing diversity onto the board?
Wow. So if there's no diversity in the faith, as I don't know what faith it is, you may not be able to find diversity in your faith, and then it would be a lot harder, because if it's a finite group of people, but do your research and make sure that's true. Again, that's the bottom line, is know for sure. There was a college in Vermont, a friend of mine was running. She was the vice president of development. I shouldn't say she was running it. But she told me our alumni are all white people, and there's no diversity here. And she was almost completely right, except for one extremely wealthy African-American guy living in New York who went there, who was an alumni. And now her board's not 100% white. There's one black guy on it, and he's their major donor for the whole place. So it depends. You may be right. And if there is no diversity in your faith whatsoever, then there's nothing you can do about it. But there could be more diversity than you think. Maybe not perfect, but there'll be more than you think.
Well, thank you, Armando, for just fielding all of our questions for today and just taking us through all of this material. Again, it is a very important conversation that we should all continue, so we do encourage everyone to do so. You can definitely get a hold of us at GrantSpace and at Candid.org on various social media channels, and I've included Armando's information on here as well. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, and shout out to folks who participated in our viewing parties across the state of California at our partner locations. On behalf of our team here at Candid and our presenter, thank you so much for joining us today. If you like this webinar, we definitely hope you join us again soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.